All right, well, thanks for joining us today, everyone. Today we're going to talk about risk analysis and analytics using Safran Risk. My name's Ian Nicholson. I'm VP Solutions with Emerald Associates. I've been conducting risk analysis training and consulting for about 20 years. I've worked in many industries doing risk analysis. I actually started using risk analysis on cost estimates and construction projects way back in the 90s. I've started working with schedule risk analysis in 2001, working with what was then PertMaster, which has now become Oracle Primavera Risk Analysis. Mary Lynn Backstrom was supposed to join us today, but she had another commitment, so it's just me tonight. So why do we conduct risk analysis? Well, there's a number of reasons. The first one is it helps project teams and executives understand and manage the risks on our project. It gets the project team discussing the challenges that are associated with the project, and it keeps the project team focused on the right issues. And when we're talking about schedule risk analysis, we're really talking about the near critical paths that may come back and haunt us. It's a requirement of many companies' gate approval process. And one of the key things that we need to understand when we're looking at cost and schedule risk analysis is to understand the dependencies between cost and schedule risk. So I live in Alberta in Canada, and here we have a group called the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, and these are owners doing mega projects. Typically, those are $2 to $10 billion projects, typically in the oil and gas industry. And they get together fairly regularly and look at trends in the industry. And as far back as 2009, they identified that project risk assessment is shown to significantly reduce project cost growth. Now ask yourself, do you build detailed CPM schedules? Do you develop detailed estimates? Well, of course you do. But still, the chances of meeting your project schedule and financial goals are still typically a lot less than you expect. So how can this be? Well, the first thing is we do very detailed CPM scheduling, but there's a problem with that. And the first problem is that the data we enter into our schedule is entered as finite values rather than ranges of uncertainty. So we might say this particular activity is going to take 3 people, 4 days, it's going to cost us $100 an hour, and therefore we're going to end up with our calculation of cost and schedule. But the problem with that is our assumptions change over time, or sometimes our assumptions don't match reality, or sometimes the project itself changes. The scope of the project, the time the project's being done in, the conditions the project's being done under, all of those things may change, which makes our scheduling inaccurate. Now, there's a classic example where people say, how long does it take you to get to work every day? And the answer is, well, on a good day, it takes me 20 minutes. On a bad day, it might take me an hour. So here's something you do every day of your working life, or at least you did until COVID came along, and you can't say exactly how long it's going to take, but you can say that to build this $10 billion project is going to take 24 months. So it's kind of silly to not think about all of the things that may come in and make our schedule uncertain. We also do detailed estimating. But the problem we have there is our estimators may be too optimistic or too pessimistic. Typically, the bid process encourages overly aggressive estimates. Sometimes estimators add their own contingency. One of the things that happens quite often is if they put a contingency line item somewhere, it immediately gets pulled out of the budget. So instead, they hide it all through the estimate. They might build those estimates on historical experience, which may no longer be valid. Technology is changing constantly. Our workforces are changing all the time. And sometimes our estimates just don't scale to match the project. If we built a $2 billion project 5 years ago, we can't necessarily say that a $10 billion project today is going to take 5 times as long. That may be quite a different project. And all these items are what we call deterministic. So the problem with deterministic items is they don't take uncertainty into account. And uncertainties can build on one another to make the project very different from what was originally envisioned. As I mentioned, there's uncertainty in everything we do. including like driving to work every day. And historically, there's no easy way to model cost uncertainties with the schedule. So we all know that if the project runs late, the costs are going to go up. And quite often we can spend money to accelerate the project. But what we really need to understand is what are those interdependencies and how do they reflect on each other? And what we really need is a probabilistic cost and schedule risk model. Going back to the COAA again, they found in their studies that on average, mega projects based in this part of the world experience a 19% cost growth and a 17% schedule growth. And as I mentioned before, cost and schedule are intrinsically linked together, and it would be silly for us to assume that we can change one without changing the other. And what we really need to understand is how the two of them relate to each other. So what's the need? Well, we need to be able to model our costs and our schedules more accurately. We need to limit and understand our financial exposure. We need reproducible results across our projects. We need to improve the likelihood our projects are going to be successful and improve management's confidence in the results. We need buy-in from our team members. We need to make sure that this is actually a tool that's going to help them. We need to increase the maturity in our risk analysis. And we need to store everything in a common database so we can always go back and look at it again. One of the challenges we always had with Primavera risk analysis, or PERT master as it used to be called, was that everything was stored in flat files, and it was very difficult to go back later and understand what all the little scenario files you made were all about. So it's we need to get everything in one common database so we can look across our projects, we can understand our portfolios of risks, and we can always reproduce the values if we need to. So tonight we're going to talk about a great solution for that, which is Safran risk analysis. Now, Safran allows us to put ranges on our estimates. It allows us to enter risk events. It allows us to model our costs with the schedule. And it allows us to do more detailed analysis of our cost and schedule models. So it allows us then to understand the probability of achieving our end dates and costs, understand the key drivers on our project and their effects, lets us run scenarios and understand our mitigation strategies. So let's take a look. I'm going to stop going with the slides. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is Safran Risk. When you come into Safran Risk, you get a welcome screen, which is pretty basic. The important things here is that, again, we can open the projects in the database. We have the ability to open up an existing project. We can import a Safran project file, a Microsoft project file, or we can import a Primavera XCR file. So all of those things are available to us. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, well, actually, before I open a project, let's look at some of the other things that we can do here. We do have the ability in here to actually look at our risk calendars. So we can define global risk calendars in the system, and those would be non-work periods within our schedule. Now, the power of defining these globally is that we can set up a calendar for, say, winter non-work periods globally, and all of the projects that are outdoors that time of year can just use that risk. They don't need to reinvent the wheel each and every time. We can also actually even import these from our from a local government agency or weather data provider, and we can generate these automatically. So you can look at the historical records and actually generate your own probabilistic calendars from those records. So very powerful. The other thing that we can do in the home section as well is we can actually talk about global risks. So if you have a standard set of risks that you want to use on all of your projects, you can define those risks here and all of the projects can pull against them. So again, very powerful if you define some standard risks like the risk of contractors going to go under, or the risk that soils reports are going to be bad, or whatever they happen to be, you can set them up once and use them everywhere. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a particular project here. And in this case, it's a fairly simple project. When I open it up, the system takes me into a Gantt chart view. Now, the thing about Safran Risk is it's built on Safran Project Scheduler. So it has all the functionality of any of the other CPM tools out there. In Europe, Safran is very much a competitor to Primavera. So you can make changes in here. You can change your logic. You can change your coding structures, your WBS, your durations, anything you need to change in the schedule, you can do here. You don't necessarily have to go out to Primavera every single time. And because of that, it gives us a lot of flexibility in how we work the model. Um, and built on top of that as well, if I move to the next tab, and by the way, the tabs across the top of the screen pretty much take me through the process that I'm going to follow when I'm doing risk analysis. So I'm going to start on the home page, and I'm going to work my way across to my schedule. I'm going to look at my schedule warnings, my project risks, my risk mappings, my cost risks, my correlations, etc. So I will work from left to right on these tabs across the top of the screen. So let's take a look at the schedule warnings. So the schedule warnings is a dynamic way for us to see any issues that may relate to our schedule. So it's going to warn us about any open ends that are there. It's going to warn us about any excessive lags or any quirky relationships like start-finish relationships, any of those kind of things. And in fact, you can get an optional module here that will do what's called a DCMA 14-point schedule check, which basically looks at the overall robustness of your schedule and will come up with a fairly detailed report about the things that potentially could be issues with your schedule. Now, if I want to go look at any particular activity that's been flagged, I can just click on the link and it will take me to that activity in my schedule. Okay, so I can go and I can fix any issues that I may have. Again, all of these things I can change right on the screen. In this case, it was warning me about a lag, so I can look at my relationships and I can change my lags if I think it's appropriate. Now, the other thing that I can do here is I can do things like I can apply filters on the Gantt screen, and those filters will carry through the rest of my tabs. So if I'm dealing with a really large schedule, maybe I'm dealing with a 5,000 activity schedule for a turnaround or something, I can use the filtering built into the tool to actually help me manage the amount of data I'm dealing with in the tabs as I go through. So again, I can define my filters. I can just go and turn on a filter. So maybe I just want to look at my construction activities. And then as I go through the rest of these tabs, they will show me the same filter. In other words, they'll only show me construction activities. So it just makes it really easy when you're trying to deal with large schedules. The other thing is the system isn't really bound by dealing with flat files because it sits on a background database. There really is no limit to how many activities you can have in the schedule. All right. So let's move on, and now we're going to talk about project risks. Now, for those of you who may have worked in the old Primavera risk analysis tool, in Primavera risk analysis, you had uncertainties and you had risk events, and they were modeled very separately. Uncertainties went on the activities, risk events went in the risk register. Here, what Safran's done is they put everything together in one place. So essentially what we have is we have all of our uncertainties and all of our risk events in one place. And what we can do, if we choose one of these particular risks, we can look at what the impact from a schedule and cost perspective of that particular risk is going to be. Now, there's a probability associated with that risk. And if the probability is 100%, then it's just going to be an uncertainty. Now, my impacts from these risks can be relative or they can be absolute. So if I'm dealing with uncertainties, typically my risks are going to be a relative impact, some percentage of the deterministic duration. But maybe I'm dealing with a risk event that has an absolute impact. Like if we don't get a permit, it's going to take 6 months to get around to reapplying for that permit. So in that case, I can define an absolute value. Now, the other thing that I can do here is I can also define a pre and a post mitigated position for any particular risk. So I can go in here and record what my mitigation strategies are going to be, what the cost of those strategies is going to be, and what my post mitigated position looks like. So again, I have the ability in the tool then to define different pre and post mitigated probabilities and the cost of my mitigation actions all within this one module. And that can be both for uncertainties again and for risk events. So, I might have a lot of uncertainty around piling, for example, and maybe one of my solutions is to spend some extra money and get a better soils report so that I have more certainty around my piling. Well, I would record in here what it costs me to get that report, and then I could change my uncertainties. And then automatically all the activities that those uncertainties are applied to, which are listed down the bottom here, would get the post-mitigated position. And I'll talk more about how I switch between them in a little bit. The other thing the tool does is it shows me what that distribution shape is going to look like. So in this case, I've got a triangular distribution with a minimum 100%, likely 100%, maximum 165%. So it shows me what that distribution is going to look like. Now, I have the ability to choose many different shapes. So, I'm not stuck with just triangular shapes and maybe uniform shapes. I can do a trigen or normal or discrete distributions as well. Okay, for those items which are only schedule related, I would have a schedule impact but no cost impact. For those which are only cost related, I would have a cost impact and no schedule impact. So I can have either or both. So on the items that are related, where the cost and schedule are related, I will turn both on and define my distributions for each of them. Okay, so once I've done that, once I've defined what my project risks are going to look like, I can then go and I can map those risks to the activities in my schedule. Now, one of the really powerful things about the way the tool works is I can have multiple risk events and multiple uncertainties all associated with the same activities and cost elements in my model. So let's go to the risk mapping tab, and let me just open this up. So the idea here is it gives me a grid pattern, and on the left-hand side of the screen here are my estimate uncertainties. And the idea here with my estimate uncertainties is I can only choose one of them. So you can see here, if I look at my design GPS system, it's highlighted with a medium uncertainty. So maybe I'll say, you know what, maybe there's a lot of uncertainty around that GPS system and I want to go with a high estimate uncertainty. When I click that, the radio button flips over here and it clears the other choice. So our estimate uncertainty risks are the ones where we can only choose one of these values. Now, you can define as many as you want. You could have extra low, high, and extra high in there if you wanted. There's no limit to how many you can define, but you can only choose one of them or none. Now, my regular risks, which again can be uncertainties or risk events, are come on the right-hand side, and I can choose as few or as many of those as I need to. So again, looking at my design GPS system, if I go down to the schedule impact tab on the bottom, it shows me, okay, these are the risks that you've got associated with this particular activity. So this activity has a medium uncertainty. There's what the distribution shape looks like. There's a merger and acquisition risk, which we see over here. And that distribution looks like this. And then there is a design risk, and that distribution looks like this. And what the system does is it puts all of those together and gives me a preview of what my overall distribution on this activity is going to look like. Now, this is really powerful because in older tools, what you would do is you'd put your risks and your uncertainties on the activity, and until you ran the model, you didn't really have a strong idea about what the impact was going to look like. So until you ran the model and clicked through every activity in the model, you couldn't really see what the distribution looked like. But here I can see very quickly what it's going to look like. So the black line represents my deterministic value, the gray line represents my mean value, and here's what the distribution shape looks like. So this allows me to save a lot of time, because if I accidentally put a risk on, maybe I've got a 1 week activity and I accidentally put a risk on it that had an absolute impact of 6 months, I would immediately see a very strange distribution shape. And so it would allow me to fix the problem before I go any further and start running the model and looking at the model and everything else. The other thing that I can do here is if I add another risk, and maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose, say let's take the external communication risk, the e-communication risk. If I turn on another risk, it immediately shows me the impact of that risk. So there's that new risk. And if I turn it on, I'll see immediately what it's going to look like and what the impact is going to look like. So again, I can turn them on or off, and I can see immediately how they change. So again, it gives me a lot of power before I waste a lot of time running a model only to find I made a mistake. A couple of other things that you can do here. If you want to turn on a risk on an entire WBS element, you can do so just by clicking on the header. So in this case, I'm going to turn on my governance risk for all of the activities under the design WBS, and now it's been applied to all of them. So it allows me to very quickly add and remove risks from my activity mappings. I can also filter on this, by the way. What I can do is I can put a filter in here and say maybe I only want to see risks that have the word communication in them, and it will filter the list down for me. I can also filter here on my activity IDs and descriptions if I want to filter on that as well. So they tried to make the system very easy for those, again, who used to use the OPRA tool. Although it worked somewhat like this, when you had a very large schedule, maybe above 3,000 or 4,000 activities, it was incredibly tedious to try and find things. So Safran's done a great job of making things very easy to see. All right. By the way, everyone is muted, but if you do have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box, and I'll answer them at the end of the session. So, go ahead and type in any questions that you might have, and we'll make sure we get them addressed. All right, I'm going to come back to the cost tab in a few minutes, because I want to just go through the rest of the analysis, then I'll go back and do the cost section, and then I'll tie the two together. So the next thing I'm going to look at is my correlation section. And the correlation section is also really powerful, because what it does is it allows me to correlate my risks to each other. So let's just turn off some of the noise here, make it a little easier to see. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at my pre-mitigated. And what I can do here is I can then define how the risks are correlated in terms of their probability, their schedule impact, and their cost impact. So I have the ability in here to do quite a detailed mapping and build quite a detailed matrix of what my correlations are going to look like. Now, I can do that for a pre-mitigated position. I can do a different correlation for my post-mitigated position. And I can also do a separate correlation for my cost model. So again, I've got a lot of capacity in the system to define how my risks are correlated. Again, going back to the PRA example, one of the things that was always challenging was if you had to do correlation, you did correlation by correlating activities to each other. And it was actually quite difficult if an activity had multiple risks associated with it. It was very difficult to figure out what the correlation should look like. All right, so let's go to the next tab. I'm going to skip the script tab. Well, let me talk about the script tab. The script tab allows me to build logic into my model so that when the model is running, I can define certain conditions to be met and then change the model based on those conditions. So the classic example would be, I'm building something, and if I complete by a certain date, everything's great. So there used to be a great example that was talking about they built an oil rig and it had to be shipped down a canal. But if the project finished too late, the canal would be frozen, so they couldn't ship the oil rig, so it would have to wait till the following spring. So there was an option to say, okay, if we get more than 70% done, we'll ship the thing down the canal before it freezes and we'll complete it in transit. We'll basically put a work crew on there and they'll keep working and living on the thing while it gets shipped up the canal. So we had this probability where we'd say, okay, if we're more than 70% done, we can still ship, but if we're less than 70% done, we can't. So those are the kind of things that you can build into the model. Again, very advanced user stuff, but they've built that into the tool so you can build some very sophisticated models. So let's go to the Analyze tab. So the first thing here is that I have the ability in here, my analysis options, to determine how many iterations of the schedule I want to run. I can also tell the system to stop when the model's converged. I can use Latin hypercube or Monte Carlo sampling. I can include or exclude my correlations. I can resource level after each iteration. And I do have the ability also to step through the model. Now, I also have the ability in here, I spoke before about my pre and post mitigated positions. Well, I have the capability in here to define for any particular risk, whether I want to use the pre-mitigated position or the post-mitigated position for that particular risk. So I can mix and match between pre-mitigated and post-mitigated positions, which gives me a lot of flexibility when I'm doing what-if analysis. Like, what does my model look like if I can mitigate this particular risk, but I can't mitigate that risk? So it gives me a lot of flexibility. I can also, let me just reset these. I can also choose to turn a risk off completely. So what I can do is I can just go and say, you know what, let's run the model with that risk turned off. We won't run it pre-mitigated or post-mitigated. We just won't use it at all. And let's see what our model looks like. So again, lots of flexibility there. The system also allows me to define what are called focus activities. So a focus activity is a really important activity in the schedule that you care about. So if you're a contractor, for example, you'd be interested in when you transfer this thing that you're building. Let's just say it's a plant. What date do you transfer ownership of the plant to the owner, to the client? You don't really care about all the demob activities and all that cleanup and all that kind of stuff. That, what you really care about is the date that you either turn the thing over or you start paying damages. So you can define those focus activities, which are typically key milestones that you want to look at in advance of running the model. And if you have a really big schedule, it just saves scrolling through the model trying to find those key activities that you care about. Similarly, you can do the same thing for costs. All right, so let's just take a look at what happens when we run the model. I'm just going to step through the model and I'm going to hit run analysis. Now, just like I would do in any of the other tools out there, I can step through the model and just make sure that things are happening the way I expect them to. Maybe there aren't some constraints in there or something that are stopping the model from working properly. When I get tired of stepping through, and by the way, I can scroll up and down in the model if I want to move somewhere else. But when I get tired of doing that, I can hit complete. And the system will take me to the distribution graph, which again is fairly standard. But a couple of things that are interesting in here, I've got my whole list of activities in here, right, and grouped again by my WBS. And as I said before, if I had a schedule filter turned on, for example, if I'd gone back to my filters over here, when I was back in the Gantt view, and I'd said, just show me construction work, when I go back to my distribution graph, it's only going to show me construction work as well. So as I said before, the filter carries through, which makes it very easy when you're looking at key areas of the schedule. Let me go back and turn that off so I can show the whole thing again. All right, let's go back to the distribution graph. Okay, so my distribution graph shows me the outcomes of each analysis, and it shows me the overall curve that came out of here, and it shows me my probabilities of achieving my goals. So in this case, my goal was to be completed on the 9th or the 26th of September, and the system's saying that's only 1% likely to occur. My P20 is November the 29th. My P50 is January the 16th. My P70 is February 22nd, and my P90 is April 21st. Now you can define which of these highlighters you want to see, and you can define as few or as many as you like. Most people don't want to see 20, 50, 70, and 90. They might want to see 20, 50, and 90, for example. But again, you can just turn those highlighters on and off as you like. The important thing here, though, is the system's telling me that I'm pretty unlikely to meet my deterministic date on this schedule, and I better be looking at adding some contingency to that schedule. Now, one of the things that's really powerful about the tool also is it does let me go and look at each iteration and what came out of each iteration. So what it shows me here is it shows me for each iteration what the finish date was. And again, I can click through and choose any particular activity I care about or any focus activity. In this case, I'm looking at the overall plan. But for each iteration, it tells me what was the start date, what was the finish date. It tells me what the cost was, and it tells me which risks fired in that simulation. So that's what the colors represent here. So the box indicates that the schedule risk fired, the dollar sign indicates that the cost risk fired, and the relative color, you know, some of these are a faded out pink color, and some are a bright red color, and some are light green, and some are dark green. That tells me where I was in the distribution, whether that particular risk had a positive or negative outcome on my overall results. And not only can I do that, but maybe I want to look at, I'll just sort them by the duration. So my longest iteration was 908 days, which was iteration 291 out of 1,000. You can see all the risks that fired. And what I can do is if I click on the iteration number, it'll actually show me the Gantt chart on that particular iteration. So I can see exactly what happened during that iteration, and I can scroll around and see what was going on with my activities. I can kind of get an idea of exactly what my schedule looked like in that particular iteration. So again, very powerful because it allows you to understand, you know, your best case and worst case scenarios. All right, so we've looked at our distribution graph. Now, so this is where we ended up, but what's really pushing us to get this distribution graph? Well, we can also look at the drivers, and this is our typically what we would call our tornado chart. And the tornado chart tells me exactly which of my risks were having the biggest impact on my schedule. And it also tells me which of the activities had the largest impact on my overall schedule. So again, I can look at that and say, okay, you know, these are the things that are having a huge impact. And, you know, that one of the things that project teams don't like about tornado graphs is that when they come up, they have these correlation numbers beside them. For example, if I look at ash cloud, it's 49%. If I look at design, it's 46%. If I look at testing overrun, it's 44%. And if I go down to governance, it's 21%. Well, yeah, that's all well and good. But the project team inevitably will say, that's kind of useless information, right? You know, all the jokes about the consultant who comes in and gives you useless information. What the project team wants to know is, what is the impact that these things are actually having on my model? Like, if I can get rid of the ash cloud, what does that mean to my overall model? Well, Safran's done a great thing here, and they've added in what they call sensitivity analysis. Now, what sensitivity analysis does is it does an analysis by exclusion. So it turns off each of the risks in turn, and then it reruns the model with that risk turned off. Then it turns off the next one, and it goes through all of your risks, turning them on and off, and shows you the result. Now, again, going back to the days of Primavera risk analysis, we used to do this manually and enter it all in a giant spreadsheet after doing each iteration, and it would literally take days to do this. In this case, the computer does it in a matter of a few seconds. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate those impacts. All right, and what the system tells me is, okay, if you can get rid of the design specification change risk, you can save 46 days on your schedule. If you can get rid of poor flying conditions, you can save 39 days. If you can get rid of the ash cloud, you're going to save 27 days. So it's actually going through and telling me based on each one how much time I could save. And that's great, except that sometimes there's interdependencies between these. So, maybe what I want to do is I actually want to run it and say, okay, if I turn off the top one, then turn off the second one, then turn off the third one, what am I likely to save? And by the way, I can look at this on a tornado basis, or I can look at it on the basis of curves. And let me just turn off all of these except the top couple. So there's the top three. And let me go down to my none. Okay, so this is what my overall model looks like. The black line represents all my risks turned on. And then the brown line represents all of the risks with ash cloud turned off, and then poor flying conditions turned off, and design specifications turned off. So that would pull my schedule back. And what's interesting is I can also look at it from the perspective of any opportunities that I have in there. So, when we talk about risk analysis, we want to make sure we're picking up opportunities as well. And here's one here that we could outsource some of the work. In this case, what it's saying is if I turn that one off, I'm going to shift my bar to the right. So opportunities would be to the right of my everything on black bar, and risks would be to the left. So what I want to do is I want to maximize my opportunities and minimize my risks, and you can see that there. But as I said, sometimes there's interdependencies between those, and maybe I want to take a look at that. And what I can do is I can actually tell the system to do multiple passes. And when I do multiple passes, what the system is going to do is it's going to, let me flip that to schedule. When I run it, let's calculate it and we'll see what it looks like. What it's going to do is it's going to turn off the top risk, then it's going to turn off the second risk cumulatively. So now they're both turned off. Then it's going to turn off the third risk, again, cumulatively. So it shows me the cumulative saving if I can turn off all of those risks. So again, it's showing me, through doing the analysis, it's showing me how much time I could reasonably save my project if I could get rid of these risks. Okay, so now let's go back and let's talk about the cost model. So when I was working as a lead scheduler on a big project for Shell, we had to do a schedule risk analysis and a cost risk analysis every few months. It was always required as part of the gate process. And one of the things that was always difficult was we didn't really talk. So I was a schedule lead, there was a cost lead, and we didn't really work together on these models. And it was kind of silly because we knew that the cost and schedule were linked together. And if the project ran late, it was going to cost more. And if we needed to accelerate, we were going to have to spend some money. But we never really sat down and worked together on it. So after a while, we started to actually take the outputs of the schedule and build those outputs into the cost model, which was a better result or a slightly more realistic result, but didn't really put everything together. So what Safran allows you to do is it allows you to build your cost risk model in the cost section. And then after we've built the cost model, we can tell the system which of our cost line items are schedule related and which ones are not. So let's just start with just the cost model. I'm going to turn off the schedule connection. And let's just talk about the cost model. So now, if I take a line item in my cost model, for example, this is my fuel system line item. It's a $2.4 million estimate value. It has a base uncertainty. It could be as little as 19 or $1.9 million. It could be as much as $2.8 million. And I can see that, again, looking at the risks, I can see the overall impact. Just like I did when I did my mapping to my schedule activities, I can do the same thing here. I can see the risks that I've associated with this particular cost line item. And here's the risks from my risk module. So my part supply risk is impacting this line item. And I can see therefore the overall result of those is a distribution that looks like this. Now, I can also relate these to my schedule. So the way I do that is once I've got my, well, let's just step back a little bit. Once I've actually built the cost model the way I want it, and I'm sure that I've got all my risks in here, and maybe I want to add another risk or two, I can choose from my risk list. So all of these items here are items from the risk module, the project risks module, which have a cost associated with them. So I could turn on um, another risk, and immediately I see the change in the result here. So I can add or remove as many risks as I want. I can also put formulas in here. So, sometimes our cost estimate isn't just a matter of getting a bunch of line items. Sometimes what we want to do is we want to put a formula in there. So in this case, what we can do is we can define a formula where we say, you know what, there's uncertainty around um, the duration of of a particular activity, and there's uncertainty around how much our costs are going to be, and then I can basically build in uncertainties into these formulas and develop my values from formulas. So if I have uncertainty around a resource rate or a material cost or delivery time, any of those things could be built into my cost model through a formula. Now, when I now have my cost model the way I want it, then what I can do is I can say, okay, some of my line items in my cost model relate to schedule. And I'm going to turn that section back on again. And the idea here is what I can do is I can go into my model and I can choose to associate any of my line items with an activity. So in this case here, where I've got my higher test site, which is a $590,000 a line item, I've said that 50% of the cost of that is associated with this particular activity. And I can define as many activities as I want. So I could put 50% on one activity and 25% on another activity and leave the remaining 25% as not time related. So the idea here is if I have my cost line items that are schedule related, I will link them to the schedule. If they're not schedule related, I won't link them to the schedule. So I have that ultimate flexibility. I don't have to build a cost loaded schedule and try and fight with that every month. I can keep them separate, but only tie them together as required. Once I've defined that, the system says, okay, you had a $590,000 activity. Therefore, and it says, okay, well, half of that would be $295,000. Over the 50 days duration of the activity you've linked it to, says that the day rate would be $5,900 per day. Now, as the duration of the activity changes, now what's going to happen is the cost of that 50% of this line item is also going to change. Now, I can define uncertainty around those rates and durations and everything else, but I have a lot of flexibility here in associating some of the cost items or all of the cost items with the appropriate schedule activities. Now, once I've done that, what I can do is I can actually go and I can see what my overall cost model looks like. So just like I did before, let me just turn on my last column here for iteration value. Now, just like I did before, what I can do is I can go back to my Analyze tab. I can use my step through function. I can click Run Analysis, and then I can go to the Cost tab, and I can see for each step what my iteration value is going to look like. So just like it did on the distribution graph, it's going to show me which of my risks is firing for each iteration. So you see the colors change on the screen as the cost risks fire or don't fire. And for each iteration, I can also see what the value, overall line item value is for that particular line item. So as I step through, you can see all those numbers are changing. And I can see my overall, if I scroll up to the top, I can see my overall cost associated with the project. So it's going between about $9 and about $11 million. Now, so that's really useful to see what's going on and what's firing. When I'm satisfied with that, I can hit complete. And now we're going to look at the cost part of our distribution graph. So now the same things that I looked at before for my schedule, and I looked at the distribution graph and I could see what my probability of achieving my dates would look like. I can look at all the same things on a cost basis. So again, what I can do is I can say, okay, my deterministic cost was about $8.15 million, which is about 11% likely to be achieved. And if I want a P50 confidence level, I'm going to have to add about $1.4 million. To get to a P70 confidence level, I'm going to have to add about $2 million. So again, I can see that distribution and what it's going to look like. Similarly, I can look at the drivers. So I can look at my tornadoes and say, what are the things that are really driving my cost? In this case, you can see my design is the biggest impact. And I can do the sensitivity analysis. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it on a cost basis rather than run it on a schedule basis. So again, all the same functionality that I had before, except this time I'm going to trigger it off cost and recalculate. So again, the system shows me my original outcome, and then it shows me how much money I can save if I can turn off each of my impacts. Okay, so again, showing me the saving as I turn each one off. In this case, because I'm doing the multiple passes, it's a cumulative impact. So again, that's really powerful and gives me a lot of analysis. But the next tab I'm going to show you is where it all kind of comes together, because here, what I can do is I can look at the scatter plot. Now, the scatter plot shows me all of my date results against my cost results. Now, the real power of this is that I can get my joint confidence levels out of this. So one of the things that typically happens is people don't just want say a 70% likelihood of achieving the schedule or 70% likelihood of achieving the cost goals. What they want is they want a combined probability of 70%. So what's the probability that we're going to achieve both our cost and schedule goals? Because our project isn't successful unless we achieve both. So by looking at this, our joint confidence level here is coming, of our deterministic value is basically 0. And it's right on the bottom part of the scale here. But let's say I'm looking for a P70 confidence level. Well, the P70 level will be right at the juncture between the orange and red bands. So you can see this line here that we go through. All of these are my 70% likelihoods. So what I could do is I could choose a particular point, say this one here, and it says, okay, that has a date of March the 2nd and a cost of about $12 million, and it gives me a joint confidence level of 71%. Now, what I might say is, you know what, that's a lot of money. I don't want to spend that much money. Maybe I'll look at a point with a lower cost, but with the date slipped a little bit. So here's another iteration where I was on March the 8th, so I slipped a little bit of time, but it's brought my cost down to $11.4 million. And that gives me a joint confidence level of 69%. And what's really powerful about this is I can choose where do I want to be on this curve. And that's the thing about the joint confidence level. It's not a single point, it's a continuum of points. And I can choose, do I want to spend more money to save time? At some point, I can spend all the money in the world and I'm really not going to save any time. And that's when this line goes vertical. Similarly, I could delay the project as much as I wanted to, and I wouldn't save any money because the line goes horizontal. So I need to decide where I want to be on that curve. And there's been a bunch of papers presented in AACE which are really interesting about where you should be on that curve and what's the optimal point that you want to be on. But the nice thing is you can look at this and you can make those trade-offs. You can look at it and say, okay, I can trade one for the other and understand where I'm likely to end up on my overall project. Now, because we've also got the costs and the schedule together, we can also do a probabilistic cash flow. So, we can develop this and say, okay, where are we likely to end up spending our money on this particular project. So maybe I just want, there's a lot of noise here. Maybe I'll just turn a few of these off. Let's just leave the P70 values on. Turn these off. So we'll leave on our deterministic and our P70 values. So then we can see, okay, here's what our deterministic value looks like, and then here's what our P70 value looks like. And we can develop essentially this probabilistic cash flow because, again, we've got our costs and our schedule related. And even the items in our cost worksheet, which are not schedule related, we can still define times when we expect the money to be spent. So even if a cost item isn't linked to an activity, we can still define when we expect the money to be spent. All right, so that's a very brief overview of Safran Risk. What I'd like to do now is I'll open it up to any questions that anyone might have. Feel free to type your questions into the box, and we'll get them answered for you. While that's going on, I'm just going to flip back to my, while you think about any questions you might have, I'm going to flip back to my slides. So some of the clients that we have using this tool, there's a number of clients all over the world, and this tool has really been popular for clients who want to move on from Oracle Primavera Risk Analysis, which was a great tool when it came out, but really hasn't been developed in a number of years. So this tool has really been very successful in being the new upgraded version. And in fact, the same development team that developed PertMaster / Primavera Risk Analysis actually developed this tool. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them. I'll give people a couple of minutes in case you have any. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Okay, so I don't have any questions. So I'll put my contact information up here. If you do think of any questions that you may have, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is there, as well as my phone number. You can also see information on our site. And we have more information, plus a number of blog articles that I've written about the relative pros and cons of Safran Risk versus Primavera Risk Analysis. So all of those things are available on our website, and there's also a great guided learning path on Safran's site. And on Safran's site, they have all kinds of white papers and things about how you should conduct integrated cost and schedule risk analysis. So again, feel free to go there and take a look at those. All right, so I'm not seeing any questions. So either I did a really good job or people are sitting in stunned silence. So again, feel free to reach out to me if you do have any questions. And we'll wrap it up at there. Thanks for attending.